Anyone remember what that is? If you had a practical joker in your family, maybe they gave you one of these for Christmas. Or if you need a Christmas idea for that person that has everything. So sometimes we called these Chinese handcuffs or Chinese finger traps, right? You remember these? You put your fingers in the ends, and then what happens? They get stuck, right? And what's your first instinct when they get stuck? Yeah, to pull, right? But what happens when you pull? They get tighter. You can't get your fingers out of them. So how do you actually release your fingers from the finger traps? Yeah, right. You actually push in. You relax your fingers and push in instead of what comes natural, which is to pull. It's called counterintuitive. Something that is seemingly contrary to intuition or common sense. It's counterintuitive. Your intuition, your common sense tells you to pull, but you really have to do the opposite. There are other examples of counterintuitive. Remember the movie Cars, right? We learned that if you're drifting, you turn right to go left, right? If you're in quicksand, what's your intuition? Your common sense tells you to struggle, but really you're not supposed to. Or if you're in a riptide, right? You're not supposed to fight against the riptide. This is the kind of thing, counterintuitivity, that's not a word. It's counterintuitive if somebody tells you need to slow down to go faster, or you need to go north to get south, or if somebody says you need to close your eyes in order to really see, or if you're ever confronted, you're not supposed to run away from a bear or a mountain lion or a T-Rex. That's what Dave said. And I don't know how he knows that, but he is some kind of an expert in T-Rexes, I guess. So if you're ever confronted with a T-Rex, your instinct is to run away, but you're supposed to remain calm. That's counterintuitive. So this morning I want to invite us into a counterintuitive Christmas. I want us to try to step back and experience Christmas for the first time, as if it were the first time. And that's really hard, because if you're like me, how many times have you heard the Christmas story? How many worship services have you been in? Maybe a lot, maybe not, but I want you to pretend this morning that the first time you heard the story, the original story of Christmas, you caught the counterintuitive nature of that story. You caught the twist. You caught the reality that this story is unbelievable. It hit me a few weeks ago. I saw this image, this picture on an email or somewhere, and I was thinking about this message, and I remember it just hit me again. I thought, how many times have I seen a manger scene on a Christmas card or on a table, and I just sort of take the story for granted, and it just struck me when I saw this very rustic picture, and we don't know exactly what the manger looked like, but it struck me again. This was God's plan. The King of the universe, the creator of all things, the most powerful divine being in the universe, shows up to save the world in this? It's counterintuitive. He comes to us in a baby. Right? Is there anything more helpless, more dependent than a human baby? And he shows up not in a palace, not even in the capital. He shows up in the family of a poor woman and her fiance, her betrothed, in an out-of-the-way place in Israel. He's a homeless refugee, is what he is when he's born. And you're thinking, God, how does this make any sense? And yet it's how God works. It's what God does. It's who God is. God himself is counterintuitive, and he invites us into a counterintuitive life. And so if I can do anything this morning, I want you to step back and see the counterintuitive ways of God and hear the invitation to step into a counterintuitive way of living. If you step back and you start looking at the passages of Scripture that prophesy, that Jesus fulfilled, we hear things like Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. The virgin will be with child. Really? A virgin? I mean, did God not pass anatomy? Doesn't God figure out this can't happen? And then in Micah 5:2 says, from Bethlehem, the smallest of tribes, will come one who will rule. Seriously? Bethlehem, the smallest? God could use some help here. He's born to a woman, Mary, the poorest of the poor, from Nazareth. Do you know where Nazareth is? Yeah, neither did anybody else. Nazareth was on the wrong side of the tracks, a podunk, out-of-the-way town. It wasn't the end of the world, but you could see it from there, that kind of place. Remember, it even had a reputation. Like, can anything good come from Nazareth? And yet God sets all of this up kind of to show his character, to show that this is the way God likes to work. We are called to worship a God who is, if we meet him and we hear the story for the first time, it's unbelievable. God in human form meets us where we are in order to redeem us, to give us hope. It's almost unbelievable, and yet we're invited to believe. Just last Sunday morning, I was in our Sunday school class in the 9 o'clock hour, and we were watching one of the videos that portrays Mary and the angel coming to Mary and announcing that, she's going to be with child. And I just remember sitting there watching that, and I had this sermon on my mind. I just thought, it was unbelievable to her. It was unbelievable to Joseph. It really still should be unbelievable to us. And I remember sitting there thinking, God, you invite us to believe something that is unbelievable, that is so counterintuitive. And I sat and watched, we had about a 10 or 12 minute video, and I just remember my heart sort of swelling like, yes, that's the God I want to worship. I believe in that God, the God that works in unbelievable ways, for that is my hope. Because he met me. He took me. He redeemed my life and your life. That's the God we serve, who comes to us in the most counterintuitive ways. I want to take you to a few verses in Isaiah 42. It's not a traditional Christmas passage. It's not one that we often read during the Advent season, but it's been on my mind because it talks about the counterintuitive ways of God. And Isaiah, from about the 40th chapter of Isaiah, clear to the end of Isaiah, is a series of chapters and prophecies that are so hopeful. If you want just hope, start in chapter 40 of Isaiah and just read to the end. There's so much hope there. And what's interesting is these stories, these prophecies were spoken and written to the people of Israel when they were at their absolute lowest, when they needed hope. They were desperate. And God comes and he speaks through the prophet Isaiah and begins to present them hope. But it's hope in a way that they would never expect. For example, in verse 1:42, the prophet speaks for God to the desperate people and says, "Here is my servant." Now, I know some of us have read the Bible so often, we've seen the word servant over and over and over again, but servant is not the typical way that you imagine a redeemer or a leader to show up. A servant or a slave is not that's not common sense. And yet, all through Scripture, God uses servants. God calls His people servants, the people He wants to use, servants. And they're not typical, they're not the kind of people we would typically think of. You have Abraham and Moses, who are called servants of God, but they're not the traditional leaders that you would think of. You have Jacob and Joseph, who aren't the firstborn sons. Counterintuitive. It's normally the firstborn sons in that culture that led. And yet God decides, I'm going to choose ones who are not the firstborn. You have David, King David, the greatest king in Israel's history, who's the runt of his own litter. He's the least of his father's sons. And God says, no, I want that one. I want the one that's least likely to succeed. If you read the Christmas story, Matthew chapter 1 is this long genealogy. We often blow right through Matthew 1, but it's a lot of fun to kind of look at the genealogy of Jesus and notice the counterintuitive names we find there, right? Scholars have pointed out that we find Rahab and Ruth and Bathsheba in this list of chosen ones, a prostitute, a foreigner, and a rape victim. And God says, yeah, perfect. These are the ones I want to use. I mean, that should give us comfort, right? Have you ever felt like, could God ever use me? Why would God choose to use me? And yet we look at all the people throughout history He's used, and He picks people like you and me that don't necessarily fit the prototype that the world looks at and says, oh yeah, leader. We have to offer ourselves to God's counterintuitive ways. Here is my servant, He says, whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations. Now, justice to the nations, that's our clue that this is talking about a king. Because a king's purpose was to bring justice. And God's purpose for kings and rulers is to bring justice to the world, to make things right, to reward the faithful and to punish the wrong. From the perspective of Scripture, justice is the reordering of life, the reordering of social power so that everyone lives lives of dignity, of security, and well-being. And in Scripture, one recognizes justice when the poor, the widows, and the orphans are included and cared for. See it throughout the whole Bible, Old Testament, New Testament. Whenever the poorest of the poor, the weakest of the weak, those without voice, the widows and the orphans, whenever those are included and cared for, God says that's justice. When everyone receives dignity and security. And this is what God is up to. God is up to caring for the last, the least, the lost, the left outs. You and me. If you want to know what God is up to, just look for what He's doing in the least of these, the weakest of the weak, the marginalized, the poorest of the poor. Verse 2 gets even more counterintuitive. This tells us how God is going to bring about justice, how God is going to bring dignity and security and well-being to everyone. He says He will not, underline not, He will not shout or cry out or raise His voice in the streets. Now think about this. This is counterintuitive because the way that pharaohs, Caesars, kings, rulers, other political leaders, the way they gain power is through self-proclamation and boastful rhetoric and big talk, empty promises, grandiose parades, political speeches, popularity-inducing performances. That's how the world works, right? That's the way that rulers and kings have always gained power. But not this king. This king leads in counterintuitive ways. And then verse 3, the second sentence here, is even more counterintuitive. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. So what's that talking about? Well, who are the bruised reeds and the smoldering wicks? They're the weakest of the weak. They're the poorest of the poor. They're the most vulnerable in our world. And he comes to, this is how kings build their kingdoms, right? They build their kingdoms on the backs of the weakest. And they go, oh, you're broken, you're weak, I'll just take all of you. This is the way the world works, don't you realize? And this smoldering wick has already been snuffed out. This king says, no. The weakest, the poorest, I will not use them to build my kingdom. In fact, this king, he comes to the weakest, the poorest, and he says, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. This king says, if you're weak, I can be your strength. This king says, I will put my treasure into earthen vessels, the weakest, the most fragile clay pots. This king says, I don't destroy people for the sake of my own kingdom. In fact, this king gathers around him the poorest, and he says, blessed are the poor because of me. This king says, blessed are the meek, the ones the world uses as doormats. This king says, no, come to me. This king says, the persecuted, I bless you. Those hungry for righteousness, I bless you. The pure in heart, I bless you. The peacemakers, I bless you. Those who mourn, I comfort you. You see, this king works in counterintuitive ways. And we're invited into that relationship and that life. See, the good news is that God is near to the brokenhearted. God is near to those who cry out. So when we feel like we are last, least, lost, left out, gang, that's exactly where God will find us. And he will meet us there. If you think about grace, right? Grace is the most counterintuitive force in the universe, isn't it? Grace makes no sense, right? Karma makes sense. You get what you deserve. Grace, you get what you don't deserve, or you give what is undeserved to someone else. That makes no sense. And yet, it's the most powerful force in the universe. It really is. And grace is not only counterintuitive, grace changes lives. And we are living testimonies, many of us, of how grace, receiving what we've not deserved, has changed our lives, has transformed our hearts. The human heart cannot be changed by coercion. The human heart can only be changed by grace. The world cannot be changed by coercion. God shows up and says the only way to change the world is through grace. The counterintuitive, life-transforming, world-changing, heart-changing power of my grace. It's the only hope we have, and it's so counterintuitive, and it showed up in a manger in Bethlehem. And the only people that showed up there to celebrate it, shepherds, who are the least of the least in their culture. They're the bottom of the social ladder. And foreigners from the east, magi from the east, who were of the wrong religion, by the way. Outsiders as far as you could get, and yet they showed up to acknowledge this king born in a manger. So unbelievable. So he's not this kind of king. He's a counterintuitive king. And it says this is how he's going to bring forth justice in faithfulness. Faithfulness simply means the ways of God. The counterintuitive ways of God, not the ways of the world, not the ways that most kings and rulers think they're bringing about justice. This king is counterintuitive. And you notice the rest of this passage. He will not falter or be discouraged. In other words, he's in it for the long haul. God sees the big picture, the overall plan. In his teaching, the islands or the nations or the world will put their hope. I mean, God has the big picture in mind. And I don't know about you, but I can get awfully discouraged when I look around me at the world. Can't you? I mean, every time I open the paper or the website and the headlines of the news recount another shooting, another act of violence, another act of injustice, I can just get so discouraged because my view is limited. My perspective is short-sighted. And God says, I've got the full picture in view. I've got the whole continuum of history in my view. Trust me. I'm bringing about justice. I mean, of course, in the last month, we've seen acts of terror. The refugee crisis, in which, there have always been refugee crises, but the news has brought this one to our attention. And I found myself struggling to know how to respond. Like, how do I respond to Paris? How do I respond to the tens and the hundreds of thousands of refugees fleeing the Middle East? How do I respond? Now, we all responded. We all said something to someone at work, at home. We all posted something maybe on social media, right? We all responded. And I found myself questioning, how do I respond? Where does that response come from? Am I just following the ways of my Facebook friends? Am I just following the ways of media? Am I just following the rhetoric of political leaders? Or is my response based in this counterintuitive truth of God? Like, what do I do? How do I respond to violence, to refugees, to injustice? I think Christmas provides a competing voice to the ways that most of us are tempted to respond. The initial impulse to respond. I think I've been challenging myself. I want to challenge you when your impulse to respond arises from within you to the next act of terrorism or the refugee crisis. Check your response against the counterintuitive God that we serve, the Christmas story, which broke all the rules according to the world. Right? How do we respond? The impulse is to be afraid, to fear. Boy, a lot of fear. A lot of fear comes when there's terrorism. And yet, the most often repeated commandment in the whole Bible is do not fear. It's repeated at least 4 times in the Christmas story. To Mary, to Joseph, to the shepherds, to Zechariah, do not be afraid. Paul says to Timothy in 2 Timothy, God hasn't given us a spirit of fear, but of love and power and of self-discipline. So when that impulse arises to be afraid, come back to the Christmas story. Go, I don't think fear is the counterintuitive response that God would call us to. The other response that rises up out of us often, and especially as nations, is self-preservation, because a nation is really compelled out of the motives of self-preservation, whether it's France or United States or other nations. They're compelled by the motive to preserve themselves, right? And nations have to do what nations have to do. But as Jesus followers, that's not our motive. That's not our response. Because Jesus says we're called to offer ourselves, to give our lives. We're called to be self-sacrificing. I mean, Jesus said in Matthew, this is, by the way, the most often repeated teaching of Jesus in the four Gospels, where he says, if you want to cling to your life, you're going to lose it. But if you give your life for the sake of Christ, you will find it. The way of Christ, the counterintuitive way of Christ, is to offer ourselves, to give our lives. Think about it. Don't we admire someone who offers their life, who gives their life for another? Why do we admire people like that? Because it's counterintuitive. Common sense says preserve, protect. And self-preservation is often a result also of fear. I was struck by an article I read from a missionary in Hungary. Hungary is one of the European countries that's receiving refugees. And this is a missionary family that serves refugees, much like Ken and Lisa Durham serve in Athens. And many of you have visited their ministry there, and we've talked about them in the last month. But they're serving refugees that are flooding out of the Middle East into Europe and other places. And this perspective from this missionary couple was so counterintuitive. This woman writes, maybe it's God's master plan to move tens and hundreds of thousands of people out of countries, out of Middle Eastern countries where the gospel is illegal, where Jesus can't be talked about, into historically Christian countries where they will meet the church of Jesus Christ and people who will love them to Jesus. She says, maybe this is all God's master plan. Now, I don't know. I do know it's an opportunity. Whether it's God's plan or not, I do know it's an opportunity that we're invited to step into. To respond as counterintuitive followers of a counterintuitive God. To say it's not about preserving my life, it's about giving. It's about offering myself, sacrificing myself for Jesus, for others. The other way that we're tempted to respond in fear and self-preservation, but we're also tempted to respond with violence. Right? The natural human inclination is to meet violence with violence, force with force. That's the human way. That's the way of the world. It happens in families, between gangs, tribes, between nations. It's just the way it always works. You kill one of mine, I'm going to kill 10 of yours. You're going to kill 100 of mine, I'm going to kill 1,000 of yours. We see it over and over and over and over again. That's the way it works. But violence will always lead to more violence. Always. Always. The alternative seems utterly ridiculous. The alternative seems ludicrous. But the Bible is full of it. A gentle answer turneth away wrath. Do you believe that? The world doesn't. The world doesn't. Meet violence with violence. Meet evil with evil. The scripture says, no, don't respond. Don't repay evil with more evil. Overcome evil with good. And the world says, that makes no sense. I mean, if you really want to be considered crazy in this world, quote Jesus. Seriously, quote Jesus. Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, hey, you've heard it said, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, life for life. But I say, turn the other cheek. And you start quoting Jesus, people will label you nuts because that's not how it works. Jesus says, you've heard it said, love your neighbor, hate your enemies. Makes sense, right? Jesus says, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Absolutely unbelievable. Completely counterintuitive. Our question as Christ followers is, will we trust the way of Jesus? Can we trust the way of Jesus in our lives? when media, politicians, social media, when everything else in the world pulls us in one direction to respond in one way, will we come back to the manger, back to Jesus, and say, no, I think I'm going to trust that Jesus has a way that's better, that's counterintuitive. You see, God has a vision for his world. And we are a part of that vision. When we say yes to Jesus, we say yes to Jesus' counterintuitive vision. And it comes back to the manger. I'm going to skip ahead here. We come back to this place, and we go, where in the world would we find Jesus? Would you ever imagine that you would find Jesus there? I mean, this is kind of what Jesus said, right? In Matthew 25, when he says, if you're looking for me, I'll tell you how to find me. When I was hungry, you gave me food. When I was thirsty, you gave me drink. When I was a stranger, you invited me in. When I needed clothes, you clothed me. When I was sick, you looked after me. When I was in prison, you visited me. Where would we find Jesus? Today, wherever people are suffering. You would find Jesus among the victims in the terrorist attacks. Where will you find Jesus? You'll find Jesus floating on a raft in the Aegean Sea, desperately seeking refuge. Where will you find Jesus? I just want to challenge you this Christmas to look in unexpected ways, unexpected places, and respond in unexpected ways. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned, Isaiah 9 says. Every warrior's boot used in battle and every garment rolled in blood will be destined for burning, will be fuel for the fire. For to us a child is born. To us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace, there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. Would you pray with me?